first tier. I'm sorry, I don't know where that accent came from, but today I'm going to be talking about the CXT-2 Trainer versus the CXT-2 Elite Carbon Trainer. So this is the normal trainer, this is the wide trainer, and then this is the Elite. I want to discuss differences to note between these shoes regarding their performance and just construction differences to note because these guys cost $150. This costs $225. That is a big difference. Does everybody need to buy this? No, and I'll discuss why, but I'll also discuss sizing and fit with these shoes too. So if you're thinking about getting the CXT-2 model or the CXT-2 Elite, you know exactly what size you should go with. But all that to say, let's talk about some differences between these shoes. So the first difference really comes down to the price and kind of the intent of these shoes, because I think that is the most important difference to note between the CXT-2 Trainer and the CXT-2 Elite. A lot of folks have DM'd me about this model on like, oh, I'm on the fence, like, is it worth it? And so let's talk about the intent of these shoes and discuss their price points. So again, these guys cost $150. So the normal CXT-2 Trainer, $150. The CXT-2 Elite costs $225. That is more than most weightlifting shoes. And so all that to say, the intent of the CXT-2 Trainer, I would say, is like more of your generalist trainer for your lifting, cross training, and CrossFit focused athlete. Now the CXT-2 Elite is very similar with its intent in the context of that type of performance, but I think about this shoe as being more of like a race day shoe. So for example, with running shoes, you have your trainers and then you have your race day shoes. Your race day shoes are typically more expensive. They might have a carbon plate in them, and you'll typically save them for either the training that you're doing right before your race or for your race. And so all that to say, with the Elite Trainer, I think of them being very similarly. And when we think about training shoes in general, we don't really have any like kind of like race day focused training shoes. And that's where I think this shoe does have a very unique angle. Now, does that mean everybody should buy this shoe? Definitely not, honestly. If you're a beginner, if you're an intermediate, if you're somebody that doesn't necessarily plan on ever competing in competitions and whatnot, you probably don't need to drop $225 on this shoe. But I do think it's interesting because with the carbon plate and with the reworked foam midsole, which I'll talk about in my next difference, this model is a little bit more versatile for running and doing more versatile workouts. And so in the context of being a race day trainer, this model I could see having an edge there. But all that to say, $150, $225, think of these as being your everyday trainer for the gym that you would want to just wear for your CrossFit WODs, beat up for your lifts, cross training, etc. And then this is a model that you'd probably want to save for either lead up to competition or for competition, similar to a race day running shoe. The second major difference to note between these shoes is their midsole constructions. So in the CXT-2 Trainer here, you have this Surge Energy Foam. So up here in the forefoot, you have this midsole that's a little bit more dense. So I describe this as being more medium density. It feels a little bit more stable. It's a little bit more firm when you hit the ground on this shoe, and it's pretty stable throughout. And so in the CXT-2 Elite, up here in the forefoot, this is a pretty big difference, but you have this Pebax foam. So essentially, this compresses a little bit easier. This foam midsole is the same material used in the Noble Drive, which is more of their like hybrid training shoe, everyday shoe, if we want to even call it that. But that said, with this midsole, you do feel a difference in the forefoot of this shoe. So for example, when doing short interval runs or WODs with running, this model is a little bit more comfortable with this foam midsole. Now, is it as stable for lifting? Not necessarily, and I think you do kind of notice that when you are getting heavier, but when it comes to pure versatility, the Elite I think does have a bit more reactivity in the forefoot. So that is a pretty big difference between these shoes, and that's why I also suggest if you're just a generalist, go with the CXT-2 Trainer because you get a lot of stability out of it, and then you'll probably have a different shoe for running workouts or running WODs where you know you're going to be running. But this model does have a tiny bit more versatility with this Pebax foam, and the midfoot and heel have the similar stability as a CXT-2 Trainer, so you're not necessarily compromising your overall stability in this shoe, especially towards the back half of it. The third difference, and obviously it's in the name of the shoe, is the carbon plate in the Elite Trainer. So you can see the carbon plate right here. It's this dark material under the shoe. It goes from the forefoot and the midfoot right here. Now, is it that important for lifting context? I don't necessarily think so, and I think where I noticed this the most was for faster runs, and so that's why, again, this model I think does have a slight edge with versatility regarding its forefoot pliability. It feels very snappy, and so that's why if you are like using this shoe for competitions, for example, and you don't know what the workouts are going to be, or you're not getting those workouts until you're a few weeks out and you want a shoe then to start wearing for those workouts and then to competition, that's where I think this could excel. It just gives you a bit more range there, whereas in the CXT-2 Trainer, you obviously do not have the carbon plate. And now summarizing all of that, the carbon plate doesn't necessarily make the shoe all out better. Not necessarily, especially when it comes to lifting. I don't really notice it for that. When doing cleans and whatnot, I find both shoes are fine regarding their forefoot flexibility and reactivity, but I do think you will notice this for any form of workout where you're doing a lot of jumping. So think like jump rope, double unders, or you're doing any form of running. So think like 400, 800 meter bouts where you're gonna be heavy on the forefoot. That's where I think you'll appreciate the snap of the forefoot of the Elite Trainer. Another major difference is the upper constructions of these shoes. So in the CXT-2 Trainer, you have this mesh textile upper that runs from the forefoot into the midfoot. And then back here in the heel, you have this additional layer here to give you more boot and ankle support. Now with this trainer, I have yet to have any issues with security or durability in them. I'd love to hear your feedback in the comments. If you've had any issues, let me know. But this upper, I think, has done a pretty good job across the board. The upper in the CXT-2 Elite is this smoother nylon and runs from the forefoot into the midfoot. And then back here in the heel, you don't have that aggressive overlay. Now, is this more durable than the mesh in this model? In theory, it might be because it does have a little bit more of a smooth material to it. It's not gonna have as much friction when it comes to abrasion from things like rope climbs or dragging your toes for burpees, but is that change worth an additional $75 for the general gym goer? I don't necessarily think so, but I do think it's a pretty cool change and it gives this shoe a little bit more of a proprietary feel on the foot. But overall, the upper constructions, while being very different, I don't think necessarily make that big of a difference regarding overall security and durability for most athletes and lifters. Another difference to note is the heel to toe drops of these shoes. So in the CXT-2 Trainer, you have a drop of 6 millimeters. In the Elite, you have a drop of 4 millimeters. Now, for the general lifter, will that make that big of a difference? Probably not. However, it is interesting that the Elite has a 4 millimeter drop, and if this is kind of like a race day shoe, and if that's kind of like this optimal drop for most athletes and lifters, I wonder why the CXT-2 Trainer is still at 6 millimeters and if they'll eventually bring down the normal trainer's drop to 4 millimeters. Like personally, I don't really notice that much of a difference. I can train in either or and they feel pretty good. And I think that's similar for most athletes and lifters, unless you do need an aggressive drop or you just love a zero drop shoe. But all that to say, 6 millimeters versus 4 millimeters. Now again, if you love 4 millimeters and you're like, I love the old Nanos, I love the old Metcons, is it worth dropping an additional $75 for a 2 millimeter difference? I'm gonna put that in your court because in my opinion, if budget is kind of a concern, I would probably eat that $75 for the 2 millimeter drop difference because again, it's not that big of a difference. And if I ever want a flat foot position, I'll just ditch my shoes and let's say deadlift barefoot and whatnot. And I'll get a nice range of both having a lower drop, but then also having a 6 millimeter drop for my training needs. Another difference that I find really interesting is the tongue construction and just the laces of each of these models. So with the CXT-2 Trainer, you have a slightly higher gusset in this shoe and the tongue is a bit more padded. Honestly, I don't mind this tongue, but it does feel a little thick at times, like thick with like 4 or 5 C's. This tongue is a little chunky and I do like the tongue better in the CXT-2 Elite. So the gusset's a little bit lower and this tongue just isn't as aggressive. It feels a little bit more pliable, it's a little bit more lightweight, and it has less padding. So all that to say, both of the tongues I think do a good job at giving you lockdown. There's not a ton of friction, but it is interesting that the gusset and the overall padding of the tongues are different. Is one better than the other? It's tough to say because I think a lot of that's gonna be personal preference. The CXT-2 Elite I think does feel a little bit better, but I don't really have any performance knocks with the CXT-2 Trainer's tongue. It's just a little bit thick for my personal preferences. And so that said, it is a really interesting change with these shoes. You also have different laces. In the CXT-2 Trainer, you have like the traditional tubular laces, and then in the CXT-2 Elite, you have these flatter laces. Both laces I think do a pretty good job with security. They don't really come undone while you're training. And so I wouldn't really stress that detail. Both of the laces I think do a good job with general security and not coming undone while you're training, but it is one of those little tiny like subtle construction nuances and differences that I think is interesting, but it's not really a make or break with either of these shoes. And before I talk sizing, which is arguably the most important part of this video, I want to do a quick performance overview of these shoes and just talk about some things that I've noticed. Now, let's talk stability first, and more specifically for general strength workouts. Is one more stable than the other? I do think the CXT-2 Trainer feels a little bit more stable, and that is for doing things like heavy deadlifts or heavier squats. With the Elite, you will notice this P-Bax foam, I think, more in the forefoot. For example, like when walking out a heavier front squat, I do notice that a little bit more than the denser Surge Energy foam in the normal CXT-2 Trainer. Now, should the general athlete and lifter worry about that per se? Not necessarily, but I do think if you have a lifting bias and you want max stability, I do think the CXT-2 Trainer is going to take the edge there. Now, when it comes to versatility, I think that's where the Elite is going to excel a little bit more. That carbon plate and this Pebax foam in the forefoot gives this model a slight edge. When running, this shoe is more comfortable than the CXT-2 Trainer. This model can work, but again, just with denser midsoles, you will have a little bit more impact compared to something like this. So all that to say, should the general person worry about it? Not necessarily, and honestly, like if you're, for example, just buying these for general CrossFit and cross training, the CXT-2 Trainer will work fine for your needs. But if you are somebody that doesn't have budget constraints and you want max versatility and max comfort for hybrid workouts or workouts where you might be doing a little bit more jumping and whatnot, the Elite can be a great pick there. But again, for the general person, I don't think it's going to be that big of a difference, and I wouldn't necessarily stress that detail. When it comes to durability, I have yet to have issues in these models, and now obviously the Elite Trainer I haven't trained in as long as I have with the CXT-2 Trainer, but I haven't had any glaring issues yet. And I think if you do invest in the Elite Trainer, I would try to save these for either competitions or like a lead up to a competition and then wearing it to that competition, similar to what you would do with a race day shoe, just to get more out of them. If you're spending $225 on a training shoe, I want to make sure that you know exactly what you're getting and you get the most out of your investment. Sizing. Let's talk about it, because with the Elite Trainer, I think you're going to want to size them a little bit differently. But let's talk about the normal trainer versus the wide trainer first. I think if you have E to double E width and even slightly wider feet, go wide. I think that will be the call for you. So with the CXT-2 Trainer, my measurement at the forefoot with the insole came out to 3 inches and 5/8, whereas in the wide version, I had a measurement of 3 inches and 3/4. So it's a little bit wider in the forefoot in the wide, which we'd expect. At the midfoot, they're both very similar, around like 3 inches and 1/4. Now that said, I do think the wide still feels wider at the midfoot, despite the insole not necessarily reflecting that, because with the wider last construction, you have more upper volume, so you will have a slightly wider fit throughout in this shoe. And so that said, if you have an E to double E or even wider foot, go wide, save yourself there. With the trainer, I think if you were on the cusp of the normal trainer, just feeling a little bit too snug, that's where the shoe is going to fit the most. So if you have an E width foot or down, go with the normal trainer. And then again, if you have an E width foot and you just like a little bit more room, or if you have a wider foot, go with the wide iteration. Now with the Elite, this model I think feels snugger than both of these shoes. And it also runs a little bit shorter in my opinion, and I think that probably has to do with the upper change and just how it probably tweaks the last construction and the feel of the shoe. And then for context, the measurements of the forefoot insole in the Elite come out to 3 inches and 5/8, and then at the midfoot it's about 3 inches and 1/8, so it is a little bit snugger throughout. And again, I think with this upper change, that's what also leads it to feeling a little bit more snug than the CXT-2 Trainer that might have very similar measurements to it. But when looking at the lengths of these shoes, like you can see it on camera right here, the Elite over here is a little bit shorter, and when you compare it to the wide guy over here, you can see a pretty big difference there between the forefoot width and then also the length of these shoes. And so with the Elite Trainer, I think if you have a wider foot, so double E or wider, you might want to honestly pass on the shoe if you're not going to size up. And if you do size up, I would say try to keep them in really good condition so you can return them, because they might feel a little bit snug for you even if you do size up. If you have a narrow, medium, or E to double E width foot, with this model, I would say go up a half size. I have the shoe in true to size, and honestly, I find them to be pretty snug. Even when wearing super thin socks, I find this model snug. If I'm wearing my like normal socks, forget about it. This model's toe box just feels a little bit too snug for my needs. So honestly, I think going up a half size in the shoe for most individuals will be a very safe call, unless you do like a very particularly snug fit with your shoe and you have a narrow to medium foot width. Hopefully that helps. So all that to say, if you have a narrow, medium to wide foot with an E width, go normal trainer. If you have an E width and you like a little bit more room or wider foot, go with the CXT-2 Trainer wide. And then in the Elite, if you have a double E width or wider foot and you love your toe box room, probably pass on this shoe. And if you have a narrow, medium, or E width foot, go up a half size to play it safe with the sizing in this model. All right, y'all, hopefully this video helps you understand the main differences between the CXT-2 Trainer and the CXT-2 Elite Carbon Trainer. If you have additional questions, or if you need more clarification on which you think you should go with, hit me in the comments below or reach out to me personally on Instagram, whichever you prefer. And as always, y'all, drop a like on the video, drop a subscribe to the channel. I will see you guys in the next one.